Across the United States, animal agriculture has transitioned from small-scale farming to concentrated animal feeding operations, otherwise known as CAFOs. What began as an effort to meet rising food demands in the United States through more efficient methods of animal production has resulted in these CAFOs dominating our food supply chains. This industry has transformed traditional agriculture into a system dominated by profit maximization and mass production, and has caused a shift that prioritizes efficiency over environmental quality and public health. It has created systemic harms that disproportionately affect both vulnerable communities and the broader food system, imposing consequences that extend far beyond the farm itself. Like most forms of technological progress, modern industrial agriculture didn't appear all at once. It developed gradually as a response to increasing demand for cheap and abundant food. In The Omnivore's Dilemma, Michael Pollan explains that industrial food systems expanded by focusing on efficiency, standardization, and output. While this made food more widely available, it also distanced consumers from how that food is actually produced. Pollan also points out that industrial food systems did not simply increase production. They fundamentally changed people's relationship to food by replacing the older traditions and local knowledge with a system that instead serves the few that control it. In his book Animal Factory, David Kirby takes this further by showing what this system became in practice. Traditional farming methods were replaced by highly concentrated operations where thousands of animals were raised in confined spaces, often under corporate control. These operations are designed to maximize output within limited space, reflecting a shift towards treating agriculture as an industrial system rather than what it was created to be, a food source and a livelihood. What's more important here is the shift itself. Agriculture moved from a decentralized system based on land and local knowledge to one shaped by industrial logic, where efficiency, profit, and control became the dominant priorities. This transformation didn't just change how the food is produced, it changed the scale and intensity of its impacts. It's that increase in scale that becomes especially important when looking at the environmental and health consequences of this system. One of the most consistent findings across research on this topic is the environmental impact of these operations, especially when it comes to waste. As the scale of production increases, so does the scale of the waste it produces, making it more difficult to manage safely. Unlike traditional farming, CAFOs concentrate large numbers of animals in one place, which means they also concentrate massive amounts of waste. Instead of being naturally dispersed, this waste is stored and applied in ways that can overwhelm the surrounding environment. Research by Joanne Burkholder and her colleagues on the topic of CAFOs and water quality shows that this waste often exceeds what surrounding land can safely absorb. As a result, contaminants like nitrogen, phosphorus, pathogens, and even antibiotics can enter nearby water systems through runoff and leaching. These processes contribute to several forms of water pollution, including red tides and green tides caused by excessive nutrients, hypoxic or dead zones where oxygen levels drop too low to support life, and what are sometimes referred to as sludge tides, where heavy rainfall can overwhelm manure lagoons and release large amounts of waste into the surrounding waterways. Government sources such as the Environmental Protection Agency recognize these operations as significant sources of pollution and regulate them accordingly. However, regulation doesn't eliminate the problem, it only attempts to manage it. In many cases, these controls are reactive rather than preventative, addressing contamination after it has already become a risk. What this reveals is a structural issue. The scale that makes CAFOs efficient is the same scale that makes their environmental impact difficult to control. And while many of these impacts begin in the environment, they do not remain isolated. They often affect the health and daily lives of the people living nearby at the same alarming rate. These effects become especially clear when looking at human health and the impact on the communities surrounding these facilities. Multiple studies by Wing and Wolf found that people living near intensive livestock operations report higher rates of respiratory problems, along with reduced quality of life. In rural communities across Oklahoma, residents often report that odors from nearby agricultural rendering facilities become especially intense during rainfall, a time when industrial emissions are more easily carried through the air. This further limits the community's ability to avoid exposure, highlighting how pollution affects the daily lives of people across the country. This example is reinforced by research from Maria Mirabelli and her team, who studied over 58,000 students in North Carolina and found increased asthma symptoms among those attending schools located near swine operations. Their findings show that these effects are not limited to just adults or workers, but extend to the children in nearby communities as well. Researcher Kelly Donham expands the focus beyond individual health by showing how these systems affect entire communities. Industrial operations are associated with economic decline in rural areas, as well as increased stress and social conflict, especially in places where these facilities are heavily concentrated. This suggests that the impacts of CAFOs are not only physical, but also social and structural, reshaping the communities in which they are located. Taken together, these findings show that the impact of CAFOs is not just environmental, it's social, economic, and deeply personal. And while these effects are already significant at the local level, they also point to broader public health risks that extend beyond these communities, particularly when considering how contaminants and pathogens can spread through even larger systems. Another major concern that has risen in the industrialization of animal agriculture is the impact of antibiotic usage. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the widespread use of antibiotics in livestock directly contributes to antimicrobial resistance. This means that bacteria can become harder to treat and more dangerous over time. In many cases, antibiotics are used not only to treat illness, but also to promote growth and prevent disease in crowded conditions, which increases the likelihood that resistant bacteria will develop. What makes this especially significant is how these bacteria spread. They can move from animals to humans through the food and water we consume, as well as general environmental exposure. Once introduced, these resistant bacteria can spread between individuals, making infections more difficult to control at a broader population level. This connects everyday agricultural practices to a much broader public health issue, extending the impacts of CAFOs far beyond the farms where they originate. As a result, this system designed for efficiency at the production level can easily contribute to long-term health risks that are far more difficult to manage. While these sources clearly highlight serious problems, they also make it necessary to evaluate the system more critically. Industrial agriculture has made food more accessible and affordable, which is a real and important benefit, and it would be inaccurate to ignore that. However, many of the costs associated with this system, environmental damage, health risks, and community impacts, are not reflected in that efficiency, but are systematically distributed outward onto surrounding populations and ecosystems. Authors Hendrickson and James describe this dynamic as constrained choice, where farmers themselves often operate within systems they don't fully control, shaped by corporate structures and market pressures. This demonstrates that the issue is not simply the result of individual decisions, but of a system that limits the range of available choices. At the same time, a key limitation across several sources is that they focus heavily on documenting these harms, without always addressing how alternative systems could function at the same scale. While this does not undermine their findings, it does highlight the complexity of the issue. Even so, when these perspectives are considered together, they point to a larger conclusion. The issue is not just individual practices, but the structure of the system itself. CAFOs represent a fundamental shift in agriculture, from localized systems to industrial production on a massive scale. While they have increased efficiency and food availability for a growing population, they have also introduced environmental and public health consequences that extend far beyond the farm. Understanding this system is essential, not only because of how it produces food, but because of how and where it distributes its costs and consequences.